June 12, 8:47 a.m. Riverside County Funeral Hall. When I stepped into the building, the first thing I saw was a glaring red notification pulsing on the administrator's screen. Funeral delayed, no family present. Body wait time exceeded. Under next of kin status it read: Megan Hayes, no response. Evan Hayes, declined attendance. Sophie Hayes, automated reply, unavailable. I felt the funeral program slip a little in my hands, the paper soft from how tightly I'd been holding it. 40 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A single line appeared across the screen. $14,250 withdrawn. Authorized by Megan Hayes. Reason: refund, personal trip expenses. The numbers seemed to float, unreal, until the funeral director approached me. His voice was low, careful, as if afraid a louder tone might fracture me. Mrs. Hayes, we cannot keep the casket closed any longer. We'll have to begin without your family. I stood there beside my husband's body, the air thick with the scent of lilies that had already begun to wilt. The hall was quiet enough that I could hear the soft hum of the ventilation system, and the echo of my own disbelief. My children were somewhere between a beach resort and their own excuses. And I was the only one left to say goodbye. In that moment, one question throbbed in my chest like a bruise. How could they do this to me? How could they do this to him? If you want to hear the full story, stay with me. Let me tell you everything from the beginning. My name is Linda Hayes, and I am 61 years old. Even now, as I say that number, it feels both heavy and strangely distant, like a date written in someone else's paperwork. For most of my life, I was simply Mom, the one who managed schedules, kept the house steady, and made sure no bill went unpaid. I worked as a school accountant for 34 years, a job built on precision and quiet reliability. Numbers never lied to me. People sometimes did. Gregory, my husband, used to say that I was the backbone of the household. He would say it gently, usually when he saw me standing at the kitchen counter balancing receipts, or when I returned from yet another parent-teacher meeting that he was too exhausted to attend. Illness had taken so much from him long before it took his life. Even so, he always noticed me. That is something my children stopped doing a long time ago. I raised 3 of them, Megan, Evan, and Sophie, each with their own temperament, their own storms, their own charms. I remember the weight of all their newborn bodies, each different in my arms. I remember their first days of school, their scraped knees, the smell of sunscreen at summer fairs, the way they once leaned into me with trust that felt unbreakable. But something shifts in a family when responsibility becomes a one-way current. Megan, my eldest, always insisted she was independent, though she lived off my help more often than she admitted. Emotional support, she called it, but the support she needed always seemed to have a financial routing number attached. She had a way of framing her needs as burdens I was supposed to carry, burdens that, if I didn't lift, branded me as cold or unhelpful. I tried not to take it personally. Mothers are conditioned to absorb blame like sponges. Evan, my middle child, had a more transactional nature. He rarely called unless he needed something, usually a cosigner, sometimes a bailout, occasionally a place to store his belongings while he figured things out. He spoke fast, lived fast, and apologized even faster, though his apologies held the weight of dry leaves. "You know I love you, Mom," he'd say, right before handing me another document he needed signed. And then Sophie, my youngest. Sweet, soft-spoken Sophie who, over the years, drifted into a curated life where everything had to stay pleasant, photogenic, and manageable. She appeared for holidays when pictures were needed, but genuine conversation, especially about my well-being, seemed to make her uncomfortable. She kept her distance under the guise of protecting her peace. I never begrudged her the softness she sought, though I often wished she would look at me, truly look, and see more than the woman behind the camera. They loved having me around. As long as I was useful. I suppose every mother reaches a quiet threshold, a moment when she realizes that her role has shifted from parent to resource. I did not want to believe that about my children, not even as their messages grew shorter, their visits more sporadic, and their expectations heavier than ever. Still, I kept giving. It felt natural. Expected. It felt like duty, the kind that settles in your bones. But standing in that funeral hall, seeing each of their names listed with excuses while Gregory waited alone, something inside me finally whispered a truth I had ignored for years. They had stopped seeing me long before that morning. And I, out of habit or hope, had kept refusing to see that. This story begins long before their absence at the funeral. It begins in the small moments. The ones that seemed harmless at the time. But, in hindsight, were the cracks forming beneath our feet. The first real crack in my relationship with the children did not come with a dramatic argument or a slammed door. No, it arrived quietly, almost politely, on a day that should have felt tender. A year before Gregory died, on our anniversary, I woke early. The house was still dim, holding that bluish light that only appears before sunrise. I lit the lavender candle Gregory had bought for me the previous winter, its scent softening the edges of the morning. I set out 2 mugs, his navy one with the tiny chip on the rim, and my white ceramic one, and brewed the coffee the way he liked it, strong and simple. He was dozing in his recliner, wrapped in the blanket our neighbor had knitted for him during his second round of treatments. His breathing was shallow that morning, each inhale a small effort. Still, when I brushed his shoulder gently, he opened his eyes and smiled, the kind of tired smile that still found its way to the corners of his eyes. "Happy anniversary," he whispered. I kissed his forehead. "Happy anniversary, love." I went back to the kitchen to plate the small almond pastry I bought from the local bakery. But just as I set it down, my phone vibrated. A voice note from Megan. I assumed she was sending something sweet, perhaps a brief message for her father, maybe even an offer to stop by later in the day. Instead, her voice came through bright and almost impatient, as if she were speaking while doing something else entirely. "Mom, honestly, your celebrations don't really matter anymore. You're not young." That was it. No greeting. No warmth. Just a casual dismissal, sent as thoughtlessly as a grocery reminder. I stood there with the pastry knife still in my hand, listening to the message again. And again. Each replay felt like pressing on a bruise that hadn't yet formed. I laughed softly at first, I think out of discomfort more than amusement. For years I had learned to interpret my children's sharpness as stress, or distraction, or simple immaturity. But something in that message was different. The ease of it. The assumption behind it. The way she spoke as though my joy were an inconvenience, a childish indulgence. I deleted the message, but the words lingered in the kitchen air, mixing with the smell of cooling coffee. Gregory shuffled in a few minutes later, leaning heavier on the cane than he did the day before. "The candle smells nice," he said, lowering himself slowly onto the chair. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what Megan had said. He looked so worn, and yet so determined to make the morning meaningful. He took a sip of coffee, smiled faintly, and reached for my hand across the table. In that moment, I told myself, don't ruin this. Not today. So I tucked the hurt into a small, quiet corner inside me, the same place where so many other small wounds had gone over the years. But this one settled differently. It didn't fade. It lodged itself like a stone beneath the surface, impossible to ignore whenever I stepped back into memory. And throughout that day, each time I looked at Gregory, his thinning frame, the way he mustered strength just to sit with me, I felt the weight of her words again. "You're not young." As though age erased worth. As though everything I poured into my family had somehow expired. Later, as I washed the mugs and wiped the counter, I tried to reason with myself. She didn't mean it. She was tired. It came out wrong. These were the excuses mothers give their children long after their children have stopped giving excuses to them. But something in me shifted, subtly but irrevocably. It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't even sadness. It was awareness, quiet, steady, undeniable. Looking back, that was the first fracture. A soft, almost invisible crack along the foundation of something I had spent decades building. And as with all small fractures, once it forms, the next ones become easier to notice. And harder to ignore. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, the way dusk slips into a room without anyone noticing until the light has already changed. Gregory's illness was worsening by then, the kind of decline you feel more than you can measure. I kept notes on everything, his medication times, his temperature, the shades of fatigue that crossed his face. Small details became anchors on days when I felt myself drifting. During those months, I leaned on hope more than I leaned on sleep. Yet when I reached out to the children, what I received in return only widened the space between us. Evan was the first to brush off the gravity of what was happening. I had called him one evening after Gregory had struggled through another restless night. I remember the sound of the fridge humming behind me, the laminate floor cool under my feet. I told him gently that his father's condition was shifting, that I could feel the change in ways the doctors couldn't yet put into words. "Mom, you're exaggerating." "I'm busy," he said, voice clipped, as if he were swatting away an inconvenience. I stared at the phone long after the call ended, feeling a thin crack open somewhere inside me. Sophie's distance came differently. It was quieter, more polished. When Gregory asked for her one afternoon, I texted her to let her know he was hoping to hear her voice. Hours passed before she replied. "Funerals are depressing. I don't want to traumatize my kids," she wrote, as if she were already preparing her alibi, long before there was a funeral to attend. I reread the message several times, wondering when comfort had started feeling like a burden to her. Then there was Megan, always ready with a suggestion that somehow excused her from any real effort. When I told her Gregory was having more bad days than good, she sent a voice note, casual, airy, detached. "Mom, maybe we can just do something online? Traveling is too much right now." As if grief could be live-streamed. As if her father's decline could be handled like a virtual meeting. Each comment was small on its own, easy to overlook in the rush of caregiving and exhaustion. But together, they stacked into something heavier. Something undeniable. Their words weren't angry or dramatic, they were indifferent. And indifference is its own kind of cruelty. On the nights when Gregory slept, I found myself standing in the doorway of our bedroom, watching his chest rise and fall. The house was so quiet then that the smallest sounds felt amplified, the click of the thermostat, the soft tick of the clock on his nightstand. I would wrap my cardigan tighter around me and breathe slowly, reminding myself that I could endure whatever the next day asked of me. But beneath that strength was a slow-growing ache. A realization that I was carrying the weight of his illness alone, not because I wanted to, but because the people who should have stood beside me had found reasons not to. I didn't resent them yet. Not fully. What I felt was a muted sorrow, the kind that settles in the corners of a home. I kept hoping they would step in, even once. I waited for a message that didn't have conditions or disclaimers. For a moment of presence that didn't need to be scheduled or negotiated. It never came. Instead, their distance became another part of my routine, something I adjusted to, the same way I adjusted the pillows under Gregory's head or the blinds to soften the afternoon sun. I told myself to stay steady. To focus on the days we still had. But there was no denying it anymore. They were drifting away, inch by inch. And I was learning, painfully, what it meant to stand alone while the people you raised slowly stepped back from the life that had once belonged to all of you. When Gregory finally passed, the house felt unnaturally still. His breathing had been fading for days, softening into a fragile rhythm that told me the end was close. I sat beside him the night before, my hand resting on his, feeling his pulse flicker like a candle in wind. At 3:12 a.m., the rhythm stopped. There was no dramatic moment, no final words. Just a quiet release, and then a silence that pressed against my ribs. I called the children that morning. My voice was calm, too calm, perhaps, but grief had a way of making everything sound distant, as if spoken through glass. I told each of them the same thing, that their father was gone, that arrangements were being made, that I hoped they could come. Their responses arrived with a coldness I hadn't prepared myself to hear. Megan was the first to reply. Her message came through as I stood at the kitchen counter, the same spot where Gregory and I had shared coffee every morning of our marriage. We already booked a Caribbean trip. Don't ruin this for us. No hesitation. No sorrow. Just irritation that grief had dared to interrupt her plans. I stared at her words, the way the timestamp read 9:06 a.m., as if even the morning hours were unwilling to soften her tone. Evan called shortly after. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. Bad timing, Mom. I can't leave work. As if funerals waited. As if death consulted schedules. Sophie sent a long message, decorated with emojis attempting gentleness. Just turn on a camera so we can join the service. I'll try to look decent. As though her appearance mattered more than her presence. As though watching through a screen counted as saying goodbye. I read each message twice, then a third time, letting the words settle like dust on old furniture. I still held Gregory's wedding ring in my palm, the indentation of it warm against my skin. I remember thinking how strange it was, that something so precious could be held so gently while the people it once symbolized showed so little care. But what came next, that was the moment something inside me truly broke. 3 days before the funeral, I logged into the joint account where Gregory's remaining medical funds were stored. He had wanted the leftover money to be used responsibly, either toward his funeral or toward the house repairs we had postponed during his decline. I typed in the password, waiting for the familiar screen to load. Instead, a flashing orange notification appeared. $14,250 withdrawn. Purpose, vacation upgrade. Authorized by Megan Hayes. I felt the air leave my chest in one sharp exhale. I checked again, thinking there must have been an error, some misclick, some clerical mistake. But the authorization was unmistakable. Her name. Her digital signature. The timestamp. All of it clear. And beside that withdrawal were 2 smaller ones. $600 labeled transportation fees. $840 labeled accommodation deposit. Both authorized by the same child who insisted she needed emotional support. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the entries. There was no guilt in those records. No hesitation. The money meant for Gregory's care, money he had earned, saved, protected, had been siphoned away for a trip. A vacation. A celebration. While I was still choosing flowers for his casket. I sat down at the kitchen table, the old wood creaking beneath me. A thin stream of morning light cut across the room, touching the corner where Gregory's slippers still sat neatly side by side. For a moment, I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger requires energy, and all I had then was a hollow ache, a disbelief so deep it felt almost physical. How could they look at that account, at the remnants of their father's struggle, and see nothing but an opportunity? That was the moment I understood. Their absence at his bedside, their clipped replies, their excuses, none of it was accidental. It was a reflection of what they had allowed themselves to become. And I, still grieving, still holding the life Gregory and I built, was finally seeing the truth without flinching. They had chosen themselves. Even over death. Even over decency. What came after this moment would change everything. But this betrayal, was the deepest cut. After the funeral, after the hollow echo of the director's footsteps, after the last lilies were removed from the hall, after Gregory's casket was lowered into earth without a single child present, I went home. The house met me with a heavy quiet, the kind that presses against your chest rather than simply fills a room. I locked the front door out of habit, though I knew no one would be coming. The sun was still out, faint and pale, casting a thin line of gold across the hallway floor. I slipped off my shoes and walked toward the living room, each step slow, as though I were moving through water. Gregory's sweater was still draped over the arm of the couch. I lifted it gently and folded it, smoothing its weight between my palms. The fabric still held the scent of cedar from the drawer where he kept it. The family photo album sat on the coffee table, its red cover slightly worn, corners softened from years of touching. I hadn't opened it in months. Not during his sickness, not during the chaotic days after paperwork and arrangements. But now, with everything behind me and nothing left to anticipate, my hands moved to it almost instinctively. I sat down, the couch sighing beneath me, and opened the first page. There we were, Gregory and I, newly married, standing under a white arch and squinting into the summer sun. I traced his face with my fingertip, the shape of his smile, the brightness in his eyes. I remembered how certain we felt then, how unafraid. We had no idea what life would demand of us. No parent ever does. I turned the pages slowly. The children appeared next, Megan as a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket, Evan with frosting on his cheeks from his second birthday, Sophie perched on Gregory's shoulders at the zoo. In every photograph, I saw versions of myself I had forgotten, younger, hopeful, determined, proud. But with each turn of the page came a tightening in my chest. A memory here, a sacrifice there. Moments of care, of worry, of stepping in so they could step out. I saw the years in which I worked double shifts to keep them in their activities, the holidays where I was the only one cooking, the quiet nights where I soothed their tears and fears and tantrums. All those chapters of devotion, and yet, when their father died, not one of them found the time to stand beside me. I closed the album halfway, letting its weight rest in my lap. My eyes drifted to the bookshelf across the room, where Gregory's framed photograph sat beside a small brass lamp. His gentle smile looked back at me, steady, familiar, unchanging. He had always been the person who saw me, even when the children didn't. I leaned back and breathed in slowly. The house felt both too large and too small, filled with memories yet emptied of the people who should have honored them. The betrayal at the funeral was undeniable, but what hurt most was the realization that it hadn't appeared out of nowhere. It had been years in the making, unfolding quietly, almost politely, until it erupted in the most sacred moment of my life. At 7:14 p.m., the kitchen clock ticked loudly, a sound I had heard thousands of times but never truly noticed. Something inside me clicked with it, something firm and final. I stood, still holding the album, and walked to the hallway. There, I reached up to the highest shelf, the one where I kept the things I rarely touched but could never bear to discard. The wood felt cool beneath my fingertips. I placed the album there, gently, as though tucking away a child. Then I stepped back and looked at the empty space on the lower shelf where it used to sit. A space now cleared. A space now mine. That was the moment I whispered to myself, quietly, not in anger but in clarity. Enough. Never again. Not whispered out of rage. Not whispered out of self-pity. It came from a place deeper than grief, deeper than disappointment. It came from recognition. Recognition of the years I had carried a family on my back while asking for so little in return. Recognition of the truth that had been unfolding before me in small, sharp cuts. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood near the window. Outside, the mountains in the distance were turning the color of ash and lavender. The first street light flickered on. Somewhere in the quiet, I felt myself rooting again, slowly, quietly, like something awakening underground. I set the glass down and pressed my palm flat against the counter. Its cool surface steadied me. I knew, in that moment, that tomorrow would not be the same as all the days that had led here. Something had shifted. Something had settled. Something had ended. And something I had long suppressed, was finally beginning. The morning after my realization, the house felt different, lighter in some corners, heavier in others. Gregory's absence still pressed against me, but something within me had steadied during the night. I woke early, before the sun rose over the roofline, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling between my palms. The steam curled upward in thin ribbons, fading into the quiet. At 8:02 a.m. I reached for my phone and scrolled to the number I had saved years ago under attorney, Collins. He had handled our estate planning when Gregory first began to fall ill. I remembered how gently he had spoken to us back then, how he encouraged us to make decisions early, before grief clouded judgment. I pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring. Mrs. Hayes? I'm so sorry for your loss. How can I help? I took a breath, steady, deliberate. Mr. Collins, I'd like to rewrite the will. There was a pause, brief, respectful. Of course. Do you have changes in mind? Yes, I said. And this time? I feel no guilt. The words surprised me with how calmly they emerged, how they carried no tremor. I looked down at the table where Gregory's reading glasses still rested beside a folded napkin. I touched the frame lightly, then let my hand fall. Mr. Collins and I met later that afternoon in his office, a small room lined with worn books and tidy stacks of documents. He offered me a glass of water, which I accepted, though my hands barely shook. He slid a fresh file in front of me and clicked his pen. Tell me what you'd like to change. I spoke clearly, each word measured. The new terms were simple. Any child who did not attend Gregory's funeral would receive nothing. No exceptions. No explanations needed. Even if they had attended, the majority of our remaining assets, our home equity, the savings we had built over decades, the life insurance payout, would go to Angela Reed, the only person who had stood beside me from the beginning of Gregory's decline. Angela was not family by blood, but she had shown up in ways my own children never had. She brought meals, sat with Gregory during treatments, drove me home when exhaustion blurred the road. Presence, I had learned, mattered more than lineage. And if your children attempt to challenge the will? Mr. Collins asked gently. Then the charitable trust receives their portions automatically, I replied. No negotiations. He nodded and began writing, his pen gliding across the page with quiet authority. I watched him, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness, only clarity. The kind that arrives when the heart finally aligns with reality. When the draft was ready, he slid it across the desk. Review this carefully, Mrs. Hayes. Take your time. But I didn't need time. I read each line slowly, letting the seriousness of it settle. The legal phrasing was cool and precise, but the meaning beneath it was deeply personal. It was the first boundary I had ever drawn with my children that held real weight. I signed with steady hands. As I left the office, the late afternoon light was beginning to shift, turning the sidewalks a muted gold. I walked to my car without rushing, the keys warm in my hand. For the first time in years, I felt an unfamiliar sense of ownership, not over money or property, but over myself. Over my choices. That evening, I returned home and placed the finalized documents in the drawer where Gregory once kept our important papers. I rested my hand on the folder for a long moment, breathing in the familiar scent of the cedar box beside it. No anger pulsed in me. No desire for revenge. What I felt was something quieter, more grounded, the certainty that I would no longer bend myself into shapes that diminished me. The children had made their choices. Now, finally, I had made mine. Within a month of changing the will, life began to fold back on itself in ways I hadn't expected. I hadn't prayed for justice or asked for anything to fall apart. I had simply decided to step out of the old pattern. But the world has a way of revealing who people are when comfort slips away. The first tremor came from Megan. One gray Tuesday morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with Gregory's navy mug now cradled in my hands, my phone lit up with 3 missed calls from her number and a stream of messages. The last one read, "Mom, can you talk? It's urgent." I called her back. Her voice, once brisk and self-assured, was thinned by panic. "Mom, they're downsizing at work." My position was cut. No warning, nothing. I could hear the clatter of something in the background, a drawer or suitcase being yanked open. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said quietly. "They gave us some severance, but the trip wiped my savings. I need help with my rent. Can you transfer something from Dad's account? He wouldn't want me homeless." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar tug of old reflexes. I pictured the withdrawal on the bank statement, $14,250, vacation upgrade, her name authorization stamped beneath it. I opened my eyes again. Megan, I said, keeping my voice calm, there is no more help in the way you're asking. Your father's account is not a safety net anymore. You chose what to do with what you took. I hope you find a way forward, but I won't be funding it. There was a stunned silence, followed by a shaky laugh. So that's it? You're just going to watch me drown? No, I replied. I'm going to watch you swim without using me as the life raft. She hung up without saying goodbye. 2 weeks later, it was Evan. His name appeared on my screen late one night, the timestamp glowing 11:23 p.m. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some part of me needed to hear what he would say. Mom, he began, no greeting, just a breath stuck to the word. The deal fell through. The investors pulled out. I put everything I had into it, and now I'm ruined. I listened as he paced, the sound of his footsteps tapping against a floor I didn't recognize. So you need money, I said, not unkindly. I need family, he whispered. I need you to back me one more time. I'll rebuild, I swear. Just co-sign the loan. Please. I walked to the window and looked out at the dark street, the lamplight pooling on the pavement. For years, I had been his guarantor, the invisible scaffold behind his risks. No, Evan, I said softly. I won't sign anything. I won't take on your debts or your gambles. You're capable, even if you don't feel that way right now. But you will stand on your own name this time, not mine. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. At last he said, so that's what I get after everything? I thought of everything, the rushed calls, the clipped dismissals, the missing chair at his father's grave. Yes, I answered. That's what you get from me now, honesty and distance. He didn't call back. Then came Sophie. Her message arrived one afternoon while I was sorting through Gregory's winter clothes for donation. Mom, can I come over? Please. There was no decoration in her words, no emojis, just plain text. When she arrived, her eyes were red-rimmed, her usually composed expression fractured. She sat at the edge of the couch, fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. The divorce is public now, she said, voice shaking. He told people I abandoned my own father, that I skipped the funeral for a vacation. Everyone's whispering. I feel like I can't walk into the grocery store without seeing it in someone's face. I folded a sweater over the back of a chair and sat across from her. Did he lie? I asked gently. Her lips parted, but no words came. After a moment, her shoulders sagged. No, she whispered. He didn't lie. Tears slid down her cheeks. Mom, I am so sorry. I thought I could keep my life neat and untouched if I stayed away from anything painful. I was wrong. Please, don't shut me out. Don't change the will. Don't erase me. I studied her face, searching for the girl who used to curl up beside me on the couch, who once reached for my hand without thinking. She was still there, somewhere, but buried under years of choices. Sophie, I said, my voice steady, I am not erasing you. I am recognizing myself. The will stands. The boundaries stand. I won't punish you, but I also will not pretend that nothing happened. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly. I handed her a tissue and waited. When she calmed, I added, you are always responsible for your presence or your absence. That isn't something paper can change. All three of them, in their own ways, came to my door asking for a version of the mother I used to be, the one who absorbed every blow and then offered more. But that woman had been laid to rest in the same season as their father. I wished them each well. I did not curse them, did not gloat over their misfortunes. Life had already delivered its own difficult lessons. What I chose, instead, was simple and new. I chose not to rescue them at the cost of abandoning myself again. They left my house each time with something different in their eyes, disbelief, resentment, wounded pride, a flicker of understanding. After the door closed behind them, the walls did not shake, and the sky did not darken. The house simply settled back into its own breathing. I washed the mugs we had used, wiped the table, and listened to the quiet like it was a language I was finally starting to learn. In that stillness, I understood that consequences are not punishments, they are the natural echo of choices. Theirs. And now, at last, mine. I did not know whether our ties would ever soften again, but I knew one thing clearly: any future with them must be built on respect and care, on truth, and on presence, not excuses. In the weeks that followed those difficult conversations with my children, the house seemed to breathe in a new way. The silence was no longer sharp or punishing. It became honest, something I could sit with without feeling hollow. For the first time in decades, my days were not shaped by who needed something from me, or who expected me to fix the damage they themselves had created. One morning, as the mountains caught the early light, a thought came to me with the clarity of cold water. I didn't have to stay here anymore. Gregory and I had talked about moving once he recovered, someplace quieter, someplace with trees instead of traffic, someplace where mornings didn't begin with someone needing something. He'd wanted a little cabin near Glenwood, a place where the air smelled like pine and where time itself seemed to slow down. He never made it there. But I still could. So I packed slowly over the next week. Not with urgency, but with intention. I folded Gregory's sweaters, keeping only the one he wore on our last mountain trip. I set aside the mug he used every morning, the navy one with the chipped rim, and wrapped it carefully in a dish towel. I went through old drawers, letting go of papers and trinkets that no longer held meaning. Every item I placed into a box felt like a quiet decision, a step toward something new. Angela helped me more than anyone else. She arrived with a thermos of hot tea, soft gloves, and the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself, it simply steadies the room. She never asked for details about the children, nor did she offer opinions. She only stayed close when I needed help lifting something or when a memory caught me off guard. "You'll like Glenwood," she said gently one afternoon while we packed dishes. "It's a place that lets you breathe." On the day the moving truck pulled away, I locked the old house behind me. The key felt heavy in my hand, not because of sorrow, but because of everything it had held: years of devotion, years of exhaustion, and the long stretch of time where I forgot myself in the name of family. I drove north with my small blue suitcase in the back seat, the one I had bought on impulse after filing the new will. It was symbolic then, now it carried my whole next chapter. Glenwood greeted me with quiet roads and a sky too wide for worry. My new home was modest, a little one-story place with pale wooden floors and a view of the mountains through a kitchen window. The first night there, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind move through the trees like a gentle conversation. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I felt safe inside my own life. Within a week, I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center. The instructor, a kind woman with silver braids, placed a clean sheet of paper in front of me and said, "Start with the light. Everything else will find its place." I dipped my brush into a soft blue pigment, watching it bloom across the page. It reminded me of morning skies, of quiet beginnings, of edges softening. In that room, among strangers who smiled at me without expecting anything, I felt something loosen inside my chest. I was no longer someone's default support system, no longer the silent scaffolding holding others upright. I was simply Linda, 61, steady, learning again what it meant to fill my own days. My routine grew gentle and grounding. Morning walks near the creek. Tea on the porch. Afternoons spent practicing watercolor washes or reading the books I once had no time for. Evenings filled with the simple hum of a house that asked nothing of me. Sometimes, I would hold Gregory's sweater or his mug and let the memories move through me without drowning me. I spoke to him in the quiet, telling him about the new plants I bought or how I still couldn't manage a perfect gradient on the sky in my paintings. I imagined him sitting beside me, smiling the way he always did when I found my footing after a hard season. This new life wasn't loud. It wasn't glamorous. But it felt like something I had forgotten how to want: peace. Not the kind that depends on others behaving well. Not the fragile kind built on denial. But peace that comes from finally choosing myself, gently and without apology. And in Glenwood, surrounded by mountains older than every sorrow I'd carried, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. A beginning. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit by the window and watch the mountains fade into dusk. The light settles softly over the rooftops, and the world grows quiet enough for truth to rise without resistance. In that quiet, I often think about what family truly is, and what it is not. For so many years, I believed blood guaranteed closeness. I believed effort could mend distance, that patience could soften indifference, that love, given freely and endlessly, would return in something like equal measure. But life has a way of teaching gently at first, then all at once. Standing alone at Gregory's funeral was the moment everything sharpened. It was the moment I understood that presence is the only real expression of love. Not promises. Not excuses. Presence. Family isn't built from shared DNA or matching last names. Family is the hand that reaches for yours when grief makes the room tilt. Family is the voice that says, "I'm here," even when it's inconvenient. Family is the person who stands beside you when the world feels unbearably heavy. I no longer chase places where I am tolerated. I no longer bargain for space in the lives of those who left me standing alone at a grave. Instead, I choose the people who show up, quietly, consistently, wholeheartedly. And I choose myself, without guilt. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear more truths, where silence becomes strength, and where women like us finally find our voices.